I think that right now we are at a decision-making point and very close to a recession. And I'm worried about something worse than a recession if this isn't handled well.
What if I told you that one of the world's most successful investors believes the United States is repeating the same dangerous pattern that led to the Great Depression in the 1930s? Ray Dalio, billionaire hedge fund founder of Bridgewater Associates, says that the economic, political, and global forces we're seeing today closely mirror those seen nearly 100 years ago. And if he's right, the implications could be massive. Listen to Dalio explain.
I want to ask you about something that's on a lot of people's minds, your predictions for the future. And I want to start with the R word. I know you think this is just a piece of it. Of course, I'm talking about a recession. Do you think it is likely that the United States will dip into a recession because of President Trump's tariffs?
I think that right now we are at a decision-making point and very close to a recession. And I'm worried about something worse than a recession if this isn't handled well. A recession is 2 negative quarters of GDP, and whether it goes slightly there, we always have those things. We have something that's much more profound. We have a breaking down of the monetary order. We are going to change the monetary order because we cannot spend the amounts of money, so we have that problem. And when we talk about the dollar and we talk about tariffs, we have that. We are having profound changes in our domestic order, how ruling is existing, and we're having profound changes in the world order. Such times are very much like the 1930s. I've studied history, and this repeats over and over again. So if you take tariffs, if you take debt, if you take the rising power challenging the existing power, if you take those factors and look at the factors, those changes in the orders, the systems, are very, very disruptive. How that's handled could produce something that is much worse than a recession, or it could be handled well.
Ray Dalio has spent decades studying long-term economic and political cycles, and in his research, he found that history tends to repeat itself in predictable patterns. He calls these big cycles. One of the most alarming patterns he's identified is how what the United States is going through right now is looking eerily similar to the 1920s and 1930s. Here's how. First, massive debt and money printing. Just like in the 1920s and early 1930s, the U.S. economy had seen a huge buildup of debt. In the 1920s, Americans went on a borrowing spree. People bought cars, appliances, and homes on credit. Companies borrowed to expand their operations. Individual investors even used large margin loans to speculate in the stock market. When this debt bubble eventually burst in 1929, it helped trigger the Great Depression. Fast forward to today. After the 2008 financial crisis, and especially during the emergency situation of 2020 and 2021, the U.S. government flooded the economy with trillions of dollars. This helped in the short term, but it created long-term consequences: high inflation, rising interest rates, and a massive national debt burden. As of the making of this video, the U.S. national debt to GDP ratio is at a staggering 125%, the highest level since World War II. A time when the U.S. had to essentially shut down the civilian economy and borrow heavily to fight a war. According to Dalio, when a country takes on too much debt, it eventually faces a painful reckoning known as a debt spiral. Here's how it works. A country borrows a lot of money to fund spending. At first, it works. The economy grows. Everyone is happy. But over time, that debt piles up, causing interest payments to increase. To keep up, the government has to borrow even more or start printing money, which causes inflation. Then interest rates rise, making the debt even harder to pay. Eventually, the country enters a debt spiral where debt grows faster than income, and it becomes almost impossible to escape without major pain like inflation, default, or austerity. The second similarity between now and the 1930s is growing wealth gaps with internal conflict. Before the Great Depression, wealth inequality reached record levels. The super rich lived in mansions while many struggled to buy food. The top 0.1% of Americans controlled 25% of the country's wealth. The Roaring '20s created tremendous prosperity, but primarily for those at the top. The average worker's wages grew at a much slower rate than productivity and corporate profits. In the 1930s, this led to worker strikes, protests, and rising political extremism. Today, the U.S. is seeing similar divisions. The richest 0.1% of Americans have 20% of the country's wealth. Since 1980, the wealth share of the bottom 50% has decreased from 20% to less than 5% today. In inflation-adjusted terms, CEO compensation has grown approximately 940% since 1978, while typical worker compensation has risen only 12%. Dalio warns that this level of inequality creates social tensions that ultimately impact politics, policy, and economic stability, exactly as occurred in the 1930s when populist movements gained traction. The third similarity, according to Dalio, is the changing global order. Here's what that means. The 1930s marked a crucial transition in global power. Britain's imperial decline accelerated. The United States emerged as an economic superpower. Germany and Japan challenged the existing order. International institutions like the League of Nations proved ineffective. Trade conflicts intensified with the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act and retaliatory measures. This changing global order and the tensions it caused ultimately resulted in World War II. Fast forward to today, and according to Ray Dalio, we're seeing eerily similar patterns. America, once the undisputed global economic leader, is seeing its dominance challenged. China has emerged as a major power, not just economically, but also in technology, military strength, and global influence. In many ways, it's now playing the same disruptive role that Germany and Japan did in the 1930s, shaking up the established world order. Global institutions like the World Trade Organization are struggling to stay relevant. The systems built to encourage cooperation are now strained by rising nationalism and geopolitical tension. Tariffs, trade bans, and sanctions are no longer rare. They've become regular tools in a new kind of economic conflict. And the battlefield isn't just about goods anymore. It's about technology, semiconductors, AI, and data control. The great power rivalry has gone digital. Dalio warns that these moments in history, when a dominant power is in decline and a new power is on the rise, are the most dangerous. Because the existing superpower resists losing control, while the rising one grows bolder in asserting itself. The result, historically, is often conflict. Ray Dalio believes the U.S. is entering a very risky period. He points to rising debt, growing inequality, and global power struggles as signs we may be repeating the same dangerous patterns from the 1930s. History doesn't always repeat exactly, but Dalio warns that when these forces come together, the outcome is often economic trouble or worse. That's what Dalio means when he says that what is coming is worse than a recession. However, this outcome isn't written in stone. Listen to Ray Dalio explain what can be done to prevent this from happening.
Very quickly, because I want to be very specific about what you mean. You're saying worse than recession. You're saying this is reminiscent of the 1930s. We should tell our viewers you correctly predicted the 2008 financial crisis. What is your prediction for where the country is headed right now?
Right now, we're at a juncture. Let's take the budget. If the budget deficit can be reduced to 3% of GDP, it will be about 7% if things are not changed. If it could be reduced to about 3% of GDP, and these trade deficits and so on are managed in the right way, this could all be managed very well. I believe that members of Congress should take the pledge, what I call the 3% pledge, that in one way or another, that they will get that budget deficit down to that number. If they don't, we're going to have a supply-demand problem for debt at the same time as we have these other problems. And the results of that will be worse than a normal recession.
So, and just to follow up on that point, worse than a recession, you're talking about the 1930s. What specifically are you warning of? Are you saying that it could be as bad as a depression? What's your biggest fear?
The value of money. What is a storehold of wealth? That is a bond. In other words, one man's debt is another man's assets, bondholders. And so we're going to be in a situation where if that storehold of wealth is in jeopardy because there's too much supply and demand and so on, and we have a monetary inflation, we will have great disruptions. And that could be like the breakdown of the monetary system in 71. It could be like 2008. It's going to be very severe. I think it could be more severe than those if these other matters simultaneously occur. Imagine if we have a downturn politically and an international conflict.
What's worst case scenario that you're warning of To be very specific, to put it into
to be
terms people
to be
can
very
understand.
specific, the value of money, internal conflict, that is not the normal democracy as we know it, and international conflict in a way that is highly disruptive to the world economy and could even be a military conflict, just as these breakdowns have occurred before. You know, we have a new order that began in 1945, a new monetary order and a new geopolitical order. And these go in cycles that can be measured. And I worry about the breakdown of that kind of an order, particularly since it doesn't need to happen, because there are certain things that could be done in which this is a better restructuring of these debts and actions taken.
In 2024, the U.S. government ran a $1.8 trillion deficit, meaning it spent $1.8 trillion more than it earned. At the same time, the U.S. economy, or GDP, was about $29.2 trillion. That puts the deficit at around 6.2% of GDP. According to billionaire investor Ray Dalio, that number needs to fall to 3% or lower, and fast, to avoid serious financial consequences. In simple terms, the U.S. would need to cut its deficit in half, from $1.8 trillion down to around $850 billion. But here's the catch. There are only two ways to shrink the deficit. One is to raise taxes, bringing more money into the government. The other is to cut spending, potentially reducing funding for things like Social Security, Medicare, education, or defense. As you can imagine, both of these options are politically unpopular. But Dalio argues that if the U.S. doesn't act soon, the cost of doing nothing could be far worse. If the government does make tough choices, there are two big payoffs. The first is the most obvious. The national debt would grow slower, and hopefully, as the economy grows over time, the U.S. may one day grow into this large debt. This is what the U.S. did after World War II. As you can see here, U.S. debt to GDP peaked during World War II at 110%. Over the next roughly 4 decades, the U.S. economy was able to grow into this debt as the economy grew faster than the national debt. As a result, by 1980, U.S. debt to GDP was below 30%. The second benefit isn't as obvious, but it's just as important. Ray Dalio believes that if the U.S. can lower its deficit, interest rates on government borrowing will also go down. And that could help the country avoid what is known as a debt spiral, a situation where rising debt leads to rising interest costs and then leads to even more debt. Let's break this down using a simple chart. Interest rates on U.S. government debt are set by supply and demand. This line here shows the supply of money. This represents how much capital investors around the world are willing to lend to the U.S. government. The other line shows the demand for that money, or how much the U.S. government needs to borrow during a given period. The point at which these two lines cross determines the interest rate the government has to pay to borrow money. If the U.S. is able to reduce its deficit, it won't need to borrow as much to cover the gap in its budget. In simple terms, if the government spends less and collects more in taxes, the deficit shrinks. Returning to our supply and demand example, this reduced need to borrow shifts the demand curve to the left, meaning less borrowing pressure. As a result, the point where supply and demand meets moves lower, leading to a lower interest rate on government debt. This might sound small, but it's a big deal. With a national debt of $36 trillion, even a 1% drop in interest rates would save the U.S. about $360 billion a year in interest payments. Those savings could play a major role in stabilizing the country's financial future. According to Ray Dalio, this isn't just about numbers. It's a race against time. Every year the U.S. delays action, the debt grows, interest payments rise, and the path to stability gets harder. So there we have it. If you made it this far in the video, it's obvious you are serious about learning about the economy and stock market. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to check out this next video here because I'm sure you will find it helpful. Warren Buffett, America is on the verge of economic war. With over 600,000 views, it is getting a ton of attention. I will see you over there.
This is gonna blow your mind. Subscribing could change the way you watch YouTube forever. Seriously, don't miss out. One click makes all the difference. Subscribing and smashing that like button isn't just for show, It tells YouTube you actually want to see more of my videos. If you skip it, you might never see my content again. So don't let FOMO get you. Hit subscribe, like this video, and let's make sure you're always in the loop. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next.